Adobe, on April 14th, 2014, the world became aware of a group called Boko Haram. They kidnapped 276 schoolgirls from a school in Chibok, Nigeria, and it galvanized the world around the cause of rescuing these girls. Can you tell us what your reaction was when you first heard about this very sort of challenging happening right in your home country?
I remember hearing about the Chibok kidnappings and being shocked, horrified. And I'll be honest, we'd been hearing about Boko Haram prior to the Chibok kidnappings. Just the month before, in February, the Chibok kidnappings happened in April 2014. In February 2014, Boko Haram had attacked a school in northeast Nigeria and slaughtered at least 40 boys in their school dormitory. So we had heard these stories, they'd been in the media, but there was just something particularly shocking about the fact that they'd taken these over 200 girls from their school dormitory in the night and taking them away to the forest. I think with the previous stories we'd heard, especially about the boys were dead. That was the end, final. But with the girls, you were thinking, what were they doing to these girls? What was happening to them? It was just so horrible.
So, Adobe, can you tell us what you learned then about Boko Haram? Because you began to do your own investigation and you traveled to Chibok, didn't you, to learn more about what was going on? So what did you learn about what had been happening already before this kidnapping of the girls had taken place?
Okay, the more I delved into the story about the Chibok kidnappings, the more we found out that I found out that thousands of girls had been kidnapped even before Chibok. There were thousands of girls. Some of them had been taken a year before the Chibok kidnappings. I remember my first trip to Chibok. I hired a fixer who was taking us around the northeast, and his cousin had been kidnapped. She'd been kidnapped for over a year. So I began to meet people whose sisters, mothers, brothers were kidnapped. And it was just almost every family I met had someone they knew or someone they were related to who had been kidnapped by Boko Haram. So it just suddenly, I realized that it wasn't just Chibok. There were thousands of girls, literally thousands of girls, who had been kidnapped before April 14, before the world got to learn about Boko Haram after the Chibok kidnapping.
And what were they hoping to accomplish by that?
Boko Haram you mean Boko Haram?
Yeah.
Nobody knows exactly what Boko Haram wants. Now, what I can say, I'm not blaming anyone, but a lot of times in this part of the world, the military, the government make mistakes that exacerbate situations. And I know that at the beginning, when the government and Boko Haram started clashing, and the government, the state really attacked them, and they fled. The Boko Haram members fled into the forest, into the Sambisa forest. This was in the early, sometime around maybe 2010, 2011, 2012. Many of them abandoned their wives and their children, or left behind their wives and their children. And what the government did in Borno State, in Maiduguri, was to go and flatten the houses of the militants and arrest their wives and children. In fact, I know of a lawyer in Maiduguri who took it upon himself to take the government to court and say, you cannot keep these children in jail. You cannot make them homeless by flattening their houses, because that was government policy. As far as you were a recognized Boko Haram member, they will pulverize your house, demolish it, and your family will have nowhere to stay. So a number of them, including Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau, his wives and children were arrested by the military. And the Boko Haram founder, Mohammed Yusuf, his wife and children were arrested as well. So I know at about that time, Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau released a video in which he said, you've taken my wives and children, I'm coming after your wives and children. I'm not saying that is why, I'm not going to blame the government on the kidnapping of girls and women, but then I can't ignore the fact that he did make that threat. And subsequently, girls and women were being kidnapped from around northeast Nigeria, because Boko Haram had been with us for years before the kidnapping started. So there is a sense, I suspect that the incarceration of their wives and children, or the harassment of their wives and children, gave them this idea to do this. In fact, I interviewed the Boko Haram commander who was arrested by the Nigerian military. He was one of the leaders. And he told me this was the reason. He told a story, cited some story in the Quran or Hadith or something, and he said the Prophet said we should do that. If people attack women are meant to be protected. However, if this happens, we attack back. He said all that. So he, gave me that impression that was one of the reasons why they started doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things about violence like that is it does tend to escalate, and you get to a point where it's very hard to say who started it, right? Because everyone's saying that you started it. No, you did. And I see. So it was.
I think Martin Luther King said something like that. Violence breeds more violence and more violence and more violence. And that's the way it's been with Boko Haram.
With Boko Haram. So, and they were, the turning point in your novel, Adoabi, is a just terrible scene in which Boko Haram comes into a village that you've beautifully described, the life in the village and the aspirations of the young girls there. One in particular, your narrator, who wants to go to school and get an education. And Boko Haram comes in, killing the men. This young girl sees her father murdered in front of her house, and then she becomes kidnapped. And it's as horrible in fiction, this is a fictionalized account you've written, but it's quite horrible to read. And it's very hard for us to understand how that kind of violence just doesn't come out of nowhere, that it is being justified in some way. And so, I mean, how did these, you have interviewed former Boko Haram soldiers,
members,
militants, and how do they justify that kind of violence, such as that murder, of indiscriminate murder?
Well, as is usually the case, they use religion to justify it. A number of them believe it's a holy war. They want to establish a caliphate in northeast Nigeria. Well, all over Nigeria, they say they want to establish Sharia law and Islam to be the government. They want to topple the democratically elected government and all that nonsense. But the interesting thing is, when you, I've spoken with psychologists who worked with these commanders, and I met some of the former members of Boko Haram myself. And it turns out that the majority of them have no idea about the Quran. So somebody just gathers them together and tells them these things. Oh, this is what the Quran says. This is what you're supposed to do. So even though it's supposed to be a holy war, it's supposed to be something they're doing on behalf of, in the name of their religion, a number of them have no idea what their religion actually stipulates. So a major component of their de-radicalization process for captured Boko Haram members is imams, Muslim scholars, coming in to teach them that their ways are not, that their ways don't correspond with what the Quran actually teaches. So the de-radicalization process actually uses the same Quran that they claim justifies their violence to, help them see the error of their ways. And, the thing is, yes, religion is often a tool in this part of the world. When powerful people want to incite the masses, it's usually religion, ethnicity, that sort of thing. So it's just yet another tool that, because there are thousands in that part of the country, that's a densely populated part of the country. They have the poorest people, the least educated people, the most oppressed people, and the largest population, densely populated part of the country. We have the men with 4 wives and 30 children and unable to feed these people. Most of them live off the field, their farms. They have no other source of income. So we have the poorest people, thousands, probably millions of them, and then doing nothing. So there's a population of people who are just sitting idly, waiting for somebody to come and pick them up and say, do this in the name of Allah or whoever. It could be Boko Haram today, tomorrow it could be some other group, but the harvest was ripe for this sort of craziness. They were just sitting there, these young people, thousands of them. I mean, when you go to northern Nigeria, you just see people sitting idly, doing nothing. idle people all over the place, and there are thousands of them. So Boko Haram took advantage of the numbers, the poverty, the ignorance, and that's what we have in Boko Haram. So they use religion to justify it, but when you really delve into it, there's nothing really religious about what they do. And that's something I try to point out in my book, that there is very little Islamic about Boko Haram.
Yes, you have two characters that are good friends before they are kidnapped, and they they're Christian girls, and they have a friend who's a Muslim girl. And you have beautiful interactions about how well the Christian and Muslim families in the village are getting along. And there doesn't seem to be any problem between the families. Is that what you found when you began investigating, that there really wasn't a big conflict between the Christian and Muslims beforehand?
In many communities around in northern Nigeria, many communities in northeast Nigeria, the Muslims and the Christians lived peacefully side by side. There was no, I mean, yes, we've had religious conflict over the years, but as I said, it's usually some politician inciting people to attack and kill and murder without them knowing exactly what the war is about. But generally, the Muslims and the Christians have lived together side by side in many communities, even including Chibok, lived together side by side. And then Boko Haram came in, and suddenly it looks as if there's been war between the Muslims and Christians, but it hasn't been like that.
Yeah, so the appeal for the young men who join up apparently a lot of the militants were kidnapped as young boys and kind of raised and trained in it. But young men, as you're saying, did find this very appealing, that a caliphate was going to be established. But it's still hard to wrap our minds around the fact that it was less about religion, and more about just finding a purpose or finding some sense of respect. Is that kind of what you uncovered? The men were longing for some meaning in their lives?
Yes, as I said, a number of them are just idle, doing nothing. So there was a sense of purpose that Boko Haram gave them. They had something to live for at last. They were fighting for a cause to establish a caliphate. I remember that a number of them are quite ignorant. So they don't even comprehend how vast Nigeria is. So their world is so small. And then suddenly Boko Haram comes and tells them that they are capturing the entire Nigeria. I mean, it sounds so stupid. Anyone who knows how large Nigeria is, how much it will take to conquer the country. I mean, beyond planting bombs in key places and frightening everyone, they cannot. There's no how Boko Haram can take over the government of Nigeria. It's just so impossible. But to those ignorant people, it seemed impossible. It seemed a cause worth fighting for, worth giving their lives. So really, as I said, they spend all their days in idleness, a number of them. So it was just the perfect way to, something exciting happening in their lives. Yes.
Things that was really quite interesting that you brought out in the novel is the reaction of the girls who become wives, they're kidnapped and then they're married to the militants as rewards for their service and so forth. And one of the girls really comes to love her husband, and the other is in a very violent relationship, actually, with her husband. And I kind of want to ask you about, first about the husband who calls himself Osama, and he wears a mask. He's a very interesting character, and I thought that in a way you were trying to explore what incites someone to this kind of life, and how do they come to glorify violence? Because his favorite thing to do is watch a video of the airplanes crashing into the Twin Towers and them falling down and cheering when people are beheaded and so forth. And there's this glorification of violence. And I wondered if you could say a little more about what you think personally about how people get caught up in embracing violence so completely.
But speaking about the Osama Bin Laden thing, the character, first of all, let me say that I usually say that my novel is journalism masquerading as fiction. I tried as much as possible to only include things I had heard or read, things that actually happened. So there was indeed a woman who was interviewed by someone else, not me directly, who said her husband wore a mask the entire time. She doesn't know what his face looks like, that he did wear a mask. And then I've heard women say that these Boko Haram members, even the Chibok girls say the same thing, delighted in watching videos on their laptops. They all had laptops and gadgets and they were constantly watching videos, including the videos of the Twin Towers crashing. They just loved watching these videos. These kinds of videos. They did enjoy watching them over and over again. And back to the issue of the 9/11 thing, I remember the time the 9/11 incident happened, the horrors of 9/11. I had a friend who was in northern Nigeria at the time. And they were, as I said, northern Nigeria is majority Muslim in many ways. And she was in a part of Nigeria, she was in a place where people were rejoicing. People were rejoicing. And the same thing happened in Nigeria. When Boko Haram began, at first it looked like a holy war. The Muslims were about to flush out. It looked like Muslim versus Christian. And at the beginning, there were actually Muslims who identified with Boko Haram, who supported them, who cheered them on, until it was clear that the violence was senseless. It was there was no method to it. They were targeting Christians and Muslims. And that was when it suddenly became terrorism. It was no longer a holy war. But at the beginning, there were people who, Nigerians, like regular Nigerians, who saw it as a religious thing. And even our current President Muhammad Buhari, he's done a lot. He has done a lot in decimating Boko Haram and weakening their strength. But at the beginning, he supported them. In fact, that's one of the reasons that's one of the points his opponents use against him, because he's a fundamentalist Muslim. And when Boko Haram started years ago, he actually spoke out on their behalf. Our current president, who's now the one pushing them back. So a number of them identified with the 9/11 thing and saw it as an extension of the jihad. And they do have these international terrorists as their heroes. So that's what I try to show in that aspect, in that character, and in that aspect of my book, that they do identify with these people. They delight in the exploits of the terrorists, people attacking America. And indeed, there was a time in Nigeria when there were people rejoicing at the 9/11 horrors. And those same people are the people who Boko Haram has gone and destroyed their communities today. And they're all in IDP camps in Borno State, begging for food and dying of disease.
So let's talk about the reaction of the girls, because, when we heard about the kidnappings, it seemed very easy to be on the side of the girls and to just assume that they all wanted to be rescued. And when I started reading your book, of course, that was my assumption. I went in, these poor girls, how are we going to save them? And you highlighted something that just never occurred to me, that some of these girls might not want to be rescued. Can you explain that phenomenon?
I don't know if I can explain it, but I can describe it.
Okay, there you go.
I know that I'm trying to recall the first time it occurred to me, maybe when I met girls. Anyway, there's something I try to highlight in my book, but if you look at the first part of my book, where before Boko Haram strikes, the culture isn't too different. It's just a softer version of the Boko Haram. Okay, I put it this way. Boko Haram simply amplified the already existing culture in northeastern Nigeria. Women in northern Nigeria, girls are giving away marriage at the age of 12, 11, giving away marriage. So Boko Haram is doing the same thing that the parents have been doing and keeping the bride prices for themselves. Girls are forced into marriages anyway in northern Nigeria. It happens every day. They have the worst statistics, I think one of the worst statistics in the world in terms of child brides. And this is without Boko Haram's help. And then, of course, the girls not being allowed to leave home without their father's permission and all that sort of thing. So they live in a society where the women are caged in anyway. Woman has no right over what happens to herself, no say. Her life is drab normally. Her life is as exciting as her husband wanted to be, or the men in her life, her father, her brothers. So we now have these girls kidnapped and taken with Boko Haram to the forest. Now, what's the difference? Simply that they're in the forest. But it's the same thing. Men are controlling their lives. They're being married off against their will. These are things that they had to deal with on a regular basis anyway. The difference is with Boko Haram is that these people have slaughtered their fathers and maybe their husbands and their brothers. So they've murdered you, but their actions are not different from what you saw other men in your normal, peaceful society do anyway. So for you, it sounds shocking that such a woman a kidnapped woman goes into the forest and falls in love with such a man and doesn't want to be rescued. It's shocking to you and to me. I mean, it's horrible what's happening. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way diminishing the horror of what they've been through. But in terms of the culture, it's not too shocking. So you now meet a man who's nice to you, who's kind, who, as the psychologists point out, psychologists who work with these women who've been rescued from Boko Haram and are still in love with their husbands, for a lot of the women, Boko Haram gave them freedom. Boko Haram said, you can join our army, you can help us to establish this caliphate. For many of the women, their lives would have just been going to this, washing clothes, having babies, and cooking for the men. But here is a higher purpose. You're joining to establish this grand caliphate in Nigeria to topple the women can fall in love with these men. They're the kind of men they meet on a regular basis. I mean, there's violence in there. I read a report a few months ago, some report done by an international organization that showed the violence in school, the violence in the streets. This is without Boko Haram. They're beaten, they're slapped, they're raped regularly. So the leap wasn't it's not as difficult a leap as it will be for you or for me who were educated. We know what's happening in the rest of the world. For them, it's just, that's the life, that's the culture. Again, I'm not saying that the horrors are normal and that they didn't experience them, but I'm just saying this could be why it was easier for them to these were just normal men to them.
Yeah, and to see, I mean, you portray it very well in the novel of the young girl who does fall in love with her husband. He's sweet to her. He gives her presents.
Mm-hmm.
He has status that he conveys on her, in the group. So she feels very, very important. And yet, her friend, your protagonist, who's unnamed, her Christian name is never given, but she's given a Islamic name, which means safety. An unusual choice for her, an ironic choice. But she resists being caught up in the propaganda that this is really what Islam is about. And what is it about her that enabled her to resist falling under the sway of the belief system of Boko Haram?
My main character was very different from the average girl in northeast of Nigeria in the sense that she was well educated. She was the most intelligent in her school. I made that clear. She read books. She had a picture of a world beyond her village. She talked about wanting to go to Lagos, to other parts of Nigeria, to cities like Lagos. She had a young man she had a crush on who will tell her stories of other parts of the world and things happening. She listened to the radio. She heard about Hollywood and things going on in strange parts of the world. And she aspired to that. So her mind was open. And there was a portion, and there was a chapter where she made it clear. She actually spoke it out to herself. And she said, clearly her intelligence was hindering her ability to enjoy her new life because she saw everyone else around her blended, just getting used to their new lives. And it was just so difficult for her. And she said, well, clearly that's the advantage of knowing too much, being too intelligent. You find yourself in that situation and you are aware of what's going on. You're aware of exactly what's happening around you. So that's exactly, I think that's what, And I see it even with the parents I interview, the Chibok parents, for example. Some are more educated than the others. And amongst the educated ones, they respond differently even to the horrors of what happened to their children. The educated ones are more, there's just a difference. They have a better understanding of exactly what has happened. You know, the horrors are clearly spelled out in their minds. The alterations to their children's destinies are clear to them. And they make it clear when they're speaking to you. They can plot the graph of what has happened, you know. But the less educated ones just think, oh, I just want her to come home. Oh, I hope she's well in the forest. You know, it doesn't really dawn on them. It's difficult to communicate this. They know a horrible thing has happened, but they don't know it in the fullness of its horror. So that's the difference. My main character was less ignorant than the rest of the girls in her village, and she read books. She read the Pipe of Hamlin. She read, she read books, and then she was expecting a consignment of Nancy Drew mysteries the week before she was kidnapped. Yeah.
Well, the horror was very clear to the world, and the world reacted almost immediately with the Bring Home Our Girls, Bring Back Our Girls,
Bring Back Our Girls,
Bring Back Our Girls campaign, and it was, in a sense, just an act of desperation. Everyone wanted to help. You know, we live far away, but it just was a tragedy that captured the hearts and minds of the world, and everyone wanted to do something. And so many people got on board with that campaign. And I'm wondering if you can let us know, did it do any good? Was that global response helpful in any way to help bring the girls back?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was helpful. I don't know if it was helpful for the Chibok girls, but it was helpful because the global campaign, Bring Back Our Girls campaign, put pressure on the Nigerian government to really go after Boko Haram because of the international pressure, the international attention on Nigeria to do something. They bombarded the Sambisa forest hideout of Boko Haram, and in the process, thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of girls, I think the first set of girls, I think about 3,000 or so, the thousands were rescued. That is, the Chibok girls out of the 200 and something that were kidnapped, 276, I think, the government has only managed to, only about 106 or 107 have been returned to their families. And when people say nothing has been done by the government to rescue girls kidnapped because all the Chibok girls aren't back, I say that's not fair. Because thousands of girls, the first batch were about 3,000. The government says they've rescued about 30,000 women and girls. I don't know if it's exaggerated, but I know that there have been thousands of girls. The first batch was 3,000. And then subsequently, almost every month, there was another batch. Huge numbers of girls, as I said, who'd been missing for more than a year before Chibok. So the Bring Back Our Girls campaign was helpful in the sense that it forced the government, compelled the government to go after Boko Haram to the point that those girls that, the forgotten girls were rescued. But in terms of whether it was helpful for the Chibok girls, I'm not too sure because it made them very valuable. Boko Haram began to see them as bargaining chips. The Chibok girls say that the Boko Haram leader, Abubakar Shekau, instructed his commanders, if they were fleeing, they had to take the girls. He said, instead, abandon your wives and children, but you must take the girls with you. So they were constantly with the leaders, and so it became more difficult to find them. Without the international outcry, they would have just been, girls kidnapped, and they would have been with the rest of the girls. But they were constantly being hidden, taken deeper and deeper into the forest. Wherever the Boko Haram leaders were, the girls would be there. But again, there were advantages. Because of the media attention of the kidnapping, they were treated differently from the typical. They weren't, the girls say things like they weren't forced into marriage. Well, I mean, when you say forced, in the sense they weren't dragged and given to men, but they were, those of them who wanted to marry, who agreed to marry, were given a choice. Two of the Chibok girls told me that. Two of the Chibok girls who got married told me that when they expressed willingness to get married, they were 10 men. They were given an option. 10 men lined up, and they were asked to choose whichever they wanted. And if there was no one they liked in that batch of 10, another batch of 10 men will come, another batch of 10 men, and it will continue until they selected someone they actually liked. And then the girls who refused to get married, rather than being dragged off and handed over to a man, they were flogged and water was poured on them. They were forced. They were forced in the sense that the pressure was put on them to make a decision, but that decision was not made for them. And then they were fed well. Abubakar Shekau made sure that none of them were raped. There was just a tension. They were given, so their experiences are not the typical experience of the typical kidnapped girl. No. They didn't suffer the same kind of violence. They weren't, because he was conscious that every single one of those girls, her name was known around the world. There were important people in Nigeria and outside Nigeria who were focused on her return home. And again, they were bargaining chips. And indeed, he turned out to be right, because when the Nigerian government negotiated the release of these girls, the first batch of 21 and the second batch of 82, the government paid, I think, 3 million euros, millions in euros, to get those girls back. Yes, a huge ransom to get them back. So the campaign made them valuable. They would have just been kidnapped girls who could have been rescued along with anyone. But now the government goes and pays such a huge amount. Reports say 3 million euros to get the girls back. And you begin to wonder, 3 million euros. Meanwhile, we have thousands of people in the north, millions actually, who are starving, who have no access to healthcare, who have no homes. And then the Chibok girls you give $3 million, 3 million euros to Boko Haram to rescue 82 and 21 and 82, a total of 103, right? Girls. Like, you start asking, people started asking, is it really worth it? How are these girls more valuable than the other girls who've been kidnapped? So it became complicated. Of course, to the eyes of the world, they're more valuable, because I hear people who say the government has done nothing. We have only 107 Chibok girls back. How about 100 and something remaining? And then these people completely ignore the fact that thousands have been released already, rescued. And they insist the government has done nothing simply because the Chibok girls are not back.
Yeah. So what is the conditions in Borno State now? Where is the status of Boko Haram? And I wonder if you can address, what you're bringing out is that the culture of that area was sort of ripe for this sort of thing to happen. Is anything changing there? Has the attention of the world on the Chibok girls brought any more help or attention to this area of Nigeria that can really use some help?
Well, a lot of help has poured into the northeast Nigeria over the past, especially since Chibok kidnappings. But sometimes you wonder, it's almost as if the help came too late. And that's something else I tried to show in my book. In the first half of the book, you had, people coming in to help, to do different evangelists distributing Bibles, doctors coming in to do free medical tests for the people, people coming in to distribute sanitary pads, that sort of thing. You saw that there was an awareness of the need in that part of Nigeria, and there were tricklings of help. And then suddenly Boko Haram strikes, and the whole world sends in, help. Everybody's help. But then it's almost too late. But then, very helpful, very needed. There's a lot of suffering, especially starvation. So it's not something that can be, the help is not something that can, it's not a one-off thing. You can't just go in and help and disappear. It's a continuous thing that will go on for years, probably decades. As I said, people are starving because they've been, in addition to the people that have been rescued from Boko Haram who are in the camps in Maiduguri, there were so many communities that were destroyed, razed. And so thousands of people have no homes. They have no farms. These are people who lived off their farms. They have no farms, no homes. And these people are living in open spaces, in camps, in Maiduguri, in tents and that sort of thing. So it's not a crisis that will go away overnight. There's a lot of help. I know when you go to Maiduguri, as I showed in my book as well, such a remote part of Nigeria, you see white people everywhere. And that's when you know that help has come from the rest of the world. When you look around and they're white, there are more white people in Maiduguri than there are. I see more white people in Maiduguri than I see in Abuja sometimes. So that's a sign that the world has sent help. Well, yes, the world is aware, but then these groups were working anyway, even before the Chibok kidnappings. But I'm sure the Chibok kidnappings helped raise more awareness about what was going on there. So definitely it helped. It has definitely helped in terms of raising awareness. However, clearly the world's attention is leaving because we have 170 girls back, and we now know exactly what happened in the forest, and some girls have said they don't want to come. You know, it's the world appears bored with that story. So we're forgetting that there's still thousands of people starving in Maiduguri, thousands of people who need help, people who are being raped in the camps. Some of them are being raped by government, by staff of the camps. And, you know, it's really horrible. It's a humanitarian crisis. I cannot even imagine how it's going to go away. It's going to take a miracle and some sustained humanitarian effort.
Yeah, a lot of sustained involvement. Yeah, I think part of what was so captivating about the Chibok kidnappings was it was just a discrete, particular event that seemed to have a solution. They were kidnapped. If we get them home, the problem's solved. And what your reporting and your writing has done is really flesh out the complexity of why something like that happened, and the kind of sustained attention that needs to be put on these areas of the world that are just ripe for this sort of false propaganda and false sense of security and importance. Adobe, I want to wrap up with a question for you about why you chose to take your reporting, your journalism around this situation and write a piece of fiction, and particularly fiction aimed at young adults.
You know, it's I got sucked into the Chibok story. I at the beginning, when the girls were kidnapped in 2014, I didn't plan to be as deeply involved. But you know, it's one of those stories that sucks you in. You do one interview, you get to do another one, you meet the parents, you hear something else, and you keep getting sucked in. Especially because the girls were missing for so long. So from 2014 to 2016, I think when we got the first girl out in May, there was, or 2016, I think, there was that, I forget now. Abraham, when did we find the first girl? Was it 2016 or 2017? Anyway, sorry. But, you know, so there was always something about to happen. Somebody had heard something about the girls in the forest. Somebody had said something, negotiations were going on. You know, there was just always, it was just a story that had no ending. So you had to stick with it. You had to stay on it. And it got to a point where some of us got to know the parents. So we became personally involved. They saw us as their voice. I mean, the parents would call, if no journalist had called them for a while, they would be terrified that the world had forgotten them. And then they would call you, asking if there was something they could do. Could they talk, please? I want to talk to the world. I want them to tell, so that I don't want them to forget our girls. So the parent, you know, that relationship with the parents and the families kept us involved in the story because they just wouldn't let go. They would call you whenever something happened. And then, of course, the girls were found. Some of them were found or rescued or whatever. And then some of us had to get the interviews. You know, I wanted to get a full story. I wanted it to end. Like you, I thought it was going to be something. The girls were missing. The families want them rescued. And then the girls are rescued. The end. But it was never like that. There was always a plot twist. And you had to keep covering it. So that was how I got involved in the Chibok story. It got to the point where I became friends with the families. They will call. Sometimes they will send you gifts of farm produce. And you go to Chibok, they host you in their house. You know, they saw us as their voice. And so when the girls were released and I heard their stories, one of the things I wanted to do with my book was to give them a voice, to give a voice to their experiences. I mean, these girls had been through so much. I wanted the world to know what happened, exactly what happened. I wanted the world not to forget what had happened. I wanted to memorialize. I wanted, you know, to give the girls a voice, really, to tell the story. And then initially it was very tempting to restrict it to Chibok, but I just couldn't do that with a good conscience. I thought there are just thousands of girls, thousands of other girls. I know the world knows more about the Chibok girls. They are the celebrities in this crisis, in this incident. But there are other girls who went through worse than what the Chibok girls went through. Their families went through worse. They were kidnapped they were in captivity for much longer. And I felt it would be inhuman. It will be irresponsible of me to just focus on the Chibok girls. So I know it would have been more marketable. Oh, the story of the Chibok girls kidnapping, and would have made more commercial sense. But I couldn't do that in good conscience. That's why my book had to include the stories of all the other girls that were kidnapped. And that's why I decided to have a nameless character. My character represents the Chibok girls. My character represents the girls kidnapped before Chibok, the girls kidnapped after Chibok, every single girl who had been kidnapped by Boko Haram and rescued. And then regarding writing a story for young people, now I know in parts of the world that young people can't even imagine that this sort of thing can happen. You can go to school in the morning and somebody comes and takes you away, and you don't return home for the next 4 years. It's unimaginable in certain parts of the world. But our young people, but these things happen to girls who were 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. No character in my book is older than 14. None of the main characters in my book are older than 14. So children around the world need to know that this is happening to their peers in parts of the world. They need to know. And the sooner they're aware, the more conscious, because being interested in humanitarian work, wanting to change the world, wanting to solve the world's problems, the best time to begin thinking those thoughts is at a young age. So when young people, I mean, even in Nigeria, I know many young people who had no idea of these kidnappings until they read my book. And then my friends call me and they say, oh, my daughter just wants to talk to you. She's been disturbing me. She keeps saying, oh, mommy, what? Asking questions, because they're horrified that this could happen in their country. But then these girls were desperate for an education, went to school, and this happened to them. So I think every young person around the world needs to know that there are people around the world who have had that kind of horrific experience. And the world, it's something that should never, ever be allowed to happen again.
Mm-hmm. You're right. You're addressing your novel to those formative years where we form our view of the world and how we fit in it and what impact we can have. And as an adult reader, I must say it was very captivating read for an adult reader as well. And I have been recommending it to my adult friends, but I'm thinking that it's a wonderful book to read as a family or in a classroom, in a school setting for children as they're trying to learn about the world and its complexity. I think that's what you did in the novel that doesn't always come across in a short news report, is the complexity of the situation and the reality of the experience of these people that are involved. And you, as you say, not to excuse the violence, but the Boko Haram militants became people in the book too. They're not just cardboard bad guys. They're real people.
Because they are people. And the interesting thing is, when I started speaking with the girls, interviewing women, especially the women who had fallen in love with their husbands and wanted to go back to them, I suddenly lost my terror of Boko Haram. You know how you're frightened, you hear about Boko Haram and, these horrible men. The more I interviewed women who were with them, even the Chibok girls, not one of the Chibok girls has a single negative thing to tell me about the men. They said they were kind, they were this, they were that. And so I suddenly lost my fears of Boko Haram. I mean, at some point I was making efforts to see if I could get linked up to Abubakar Shekau and interview him. That was how fearless I was. I was actually making efforts to reach out to him for an interview, and then it hasn't happened yet, but I tried. So that's the thing. I lost my fears because these women I realized they made them they described the men as human in ways I saw them as human beings. They were demystified. All that fear and terror left, and that's the way it was for many of the girls who spent time with them. I mean, the Chibok girls have nothing negative to tell me about the Boko Haram kidnappings. In fact, I've been with Chibok girls, or a particular Chibok girl, for example. Her family, I was with her in her family house, and every member of her family was talking negative about, and she kept about Boko Haram, and she kept silent throughout. And then in private, she would tell me, there's nothing bad. In fact, a common phrase the girls use is, nothing bad happened in the forest. They will tell you that nothing bad happened to us. Nothing bad. They didn't do anything bad. They talk about them as if they are humans, as if they're regular human beings. And they had nicknames for their captors. The girls had nicknames for them. Jocular names. Then taking it back, there's something I wanted to say when we're talking about writing for younger audience. I'll give this example of the impact a book like this can have. A friend of mine told me that after her daughter, who's about 12, read my book, every morning when they're having family prayers, the family gets together to pray in the morning, her daughter says, let's pray for the kidnapped girls, the girls that are still in Boko Haram captivity. That happened after she read my book. So suddenly every morning she wants to pray for those girls. Prior to then, so she reminds the family, can we please pray for the girls that are, you see? So that's how powerful it can be when at that young age they're made aware of what happens around the world.
Adobe, we are so honored here at the Raven Foundation that you have accepted the 2018 Raven Award for Excellence in Arts and Entertainment for your young adult novel, Buried Beneath the Baobab Tree. It is an extraordinary book and tells an incredible story about a very difficult situation that captured the attention of the world. And you've really done a wonderful job bringing us into the lives of the young girls and the men that were involved in the Boko Haram kidnapping. So I want to thank you and express our gratitude for you accepting the award this year.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you to you and to the Raven Foundation for selecting me and my book for this award. I feel honored, and I'm happy that with this award, the voices of the girls who have been through these horrors under Boko Haram can be further amplified to Americans and around the world. Thank you so much for honoring me.
Thank you, Adobe.